As the great peace of the Republic waned and diplomatic crises began to spring up across the galaxy, the Jedi Knights and their allies in the Republic Diplomatic Corps found themselves traveling all across the galaxy, putting out fires wherever they could. When they did, they often traveled in a specific class of vessel seen in the opening shots of the Phantom Menace, the Consular-Class space cruiser. This small, unarmed corvette was a symbol of Republic authority in the years before the Battle of Naboo, and in this video, we'll be taking a close look at this remarkable vessel.
Attention, Sergeant on deck!
The Consular-Class cruiser was a product of the Corellian Engineering Corporation, and many ships of the class were assembled in the great orbital shipyards of Corellia itself, made for the Judicial Forces and Republic Diplomatic Corps. At 115 meters in length, the Consular blurred the line between a large transport ship and a corvette. Though it's sometimes called the Republic frigate, it was officially a passenger cruiser, and in later eras, it operated as a corvette in combat. It was a compact but well-equipped ship, piloted by small crews to minimize the risk of eavesdropping for the high-stakes negotiations that often took place aboard these vessels. For most of its length, the Consular was a narrow vessel with a small profile, though it widened out dramatically at its aft end. The aft quarter of the ship was mostly given over to the ship's propulsion and communications systems, with only a few small maintenance areas winding between. The ship's main reactor was located directly beneath its comms array, with fuel tanks to either side. Additional power cells and the fuel lines were located in a fan-shaped section between the reactor and the ship's 3 engines, which were connected by pairs of radiator panels. The vessel's hyperdrive, a Longair Voltran's Triarch CD 3.2, was located adjacent to the reactor, while its main sublight thrusters, a trio of Dyne 577 radial atomizers, were located at the very back of the ship. These 3 thrusters were exceptionally powerful, giving the Consular a maximum atmospheric speed of 900 km per hour and a maximum acceleration of 2040 Gs in outer space. Thanks to a comprehensive bank of maneuvering thrusters, 4 of which were located on the underside of the midsection and 2 of which were located at the fore of the Salon pod, the Consular was also very maneuverable. Its hyperdrive was rated as a Class 2.0, which was considered decently fast for its time. The aft section also featured the Consular-Class's communications array, a collection of a dozen different kinds of antennae and dishes located above the main reactor. This eclectic array allowed the Consular to pick up and return even the most alien forms of communication, as the ship was designed before the Imperial standardization of the galaxy's communication systems. Just ahead of the communications array, along the top of the midsection, was the ship's deflector shield generators. The ship's sensors, meanwhile, were located at the bow, with the main sensors located below the cockpit and an additional sensor dish mounted just off to the side. The ship's interior was accessed via a loading ramp on the underside of the midsection or by a pair of docking rings at the junction of the aft and midsection. The Consular-Class cruiser had a crew of 8 or 9 organic personnel, depending on configuration, consisting of the ship's captain, 2 co-pilots, a navigator, communications officer, 3 technicians, and sometimes an additional pilot, all of them Judicial Forces personnel. The technicians operated throughout the ship, while the remaining personnel all had stations on the command deck, which was separate from the diplomatic sections of the vessel. This was intended to allow visiting dignitaries privacy and security. This small crew was assisted by a large retinue of droids, however, most notably a small army of R2 series astromechs. The number of droid personnel aboard the average Consular-Class cruiser is unknown, but they played a vital role in maintaining the ship at the direction of the crew. The Consular also had quarters for 16 passengers, typically Jedi, diplomats, or visiting dignitaries, and its escape craft could evacuate 32 people and droids in total. The Consular was also configured to carry up to 1,000 metric tons of cargo. The interior of the Consular-Class cruiser was divided into 4 decks, which were connected by 2 turbo lifts, one towards the aft between the docking rings and another at the back of the command deck toward the fore. The uppermost deck was the command deck from which the ship was operated. The two decks below were the ambassadorial suites, while the lowest deck was dominated by the cargo hold and maintenance areas. The lower three decks were mostly concentrated in the ship's midsection, with the second lowest deck being the widest and occupying the flared out wing sections, and the lowest and second highest decks being narrower. The topmost deck was contained in a dorsal bulge toward the forward end of the ship. Apart from cargo storage and maintenance areas, the bottom deck contained the ship's boarding ramp and the access chutes to the cruiser's two escape pods, which were located on the underside of the ship's midsection wings, each mounted just behind the forward landing gear. These escape pods could each seat 8 people, and they were equipped with their own maneuvering thrusters and sensors. Just above that level was the main deck, which contained the docking ring entry vestibule as well as a lounge, formal dining room, and other diplomatic suites. The crew quarters were located at the forward end of this deck, as was the droid hold. The deck above contained staterooms for visiting dignitaries, each of them fairly spacious for such a small craft. Then there was the top deck, the smallest of the four, which, from back to front, contained a crew lounge, the communication station, the navigator station, and the cockpit where the captain and both co-pilots were stationed. Below the cockpit, connected by airlock to the main deck, was a large, rounded salon pod, which was where formal negotiations took place. This was the most secure part of the ship, heavily armored and insulated against eavesdropping or interference, with its own separate life support systems and power grid. These pods were interchangeable, and some were configured to accommodate dignitaries with radically non-human biological needs. Within the pod was a single large stateroom that contained a hologram pad table and seating for 16 beings. The holographics communication systems within the pod were secure, allowing for dignitaries within the pod to communicate securely with beings outside of it. Often, Jedi making use of these craft attended High Council briefings from the Salon pod. In times of emergency, the Salon pod could detach from the rest of the ship and function as a large, heavily armored escape pod. When this occurred, the cowlings and magnetic clamps holding the pod in place would be released, and the pod's 4 thrusters and sensor systems would activate. The Salon pod had its own complete sensor array and life support system, allowing it to operate as a fully functional shuttlecraft for a few hours at a time. The original line of Consular-Class cruisers was entirely unarmed, though these ships still featured respectably tough armor and especially strong shields. They were strictly diplomatic craft, and they had diplomatic immunity as Republic ambassadorial ships. This was signified by the ship's scarlet markings, which were known across the galaxy as the symbol of neutral, diplomatically immune Republic ambassadors. Cruisers representing sector governments had red stripes, while those dispatched from the highest level of Republic government on Coruscant were painted bright red all over. This is exemplified by the Consular-Class cruiser seen in the Phantom Menace, the Radiant 7, commanded by Captain Maui Makador, which saw action from the Battle of Galadran to the blockade of Naboo. During the later years of the Great Peace of the Republic, the Consular-Class cruiser was the favorite ship of Jedi ambassadors and Republic diplomats, and was also used extensively by the Judicial Forces, an Outland Region's security force. The ORSF and Judicials often upgraded Consular-Class cruisers with weapons pods for use as fast-acting corvettes, but even into the time of the Separatist crisis, the vast majority of these vessels remained unarmed, a symbol of Supreme Chancellor Palpatine's stated view that negotiations would prevail and prevent a need for war. Of course, Palpatine never actually believed that, and he himself ensured that this belief would be proven wrong. And with the eruption of the Clone Wars, most ships of the Consular-Class were finally armed, with some even being converted into warships on the express order of the Supreme Chancellor. The Charger C-70 retrofit converted much of the Republic's diplomatic fleet into combat-capable corvettes, and new Consular-Class cruisers were built for use as warships, though this was likely done somewhere other than Corellia, which was neutral for the first half of the war. The most noticeable feature of these refitted vessels were their new weapons, but the retrofit actually overhauled a lot more. The Consular-Class received a new, faster hyperdrive with a 1.5 rating, allowing it to keep pace with newer and faster Republic warships, and its interior sections were completely reconfigured. The ship's diplomatic chambers were converted into troop barracks, additional escape pod berths, and a greatly expanded cargo hold, allowing the vessel to perform better as a warship. These new Consular-Class cruisers featured 2 additional escape pods, could carry an extra 5,000 tons of cargo, could quarter half a platoon of clone troopers, and featured extensive troop support sections, including a small medical bay staffed by a 2-1B surgical droid. The communications array was greatly simplified, while several new Salon pod models were introduced, including boarding pods and command pod variants. As far as weapons went, the refitted Consular-Class cruisers were armed with 5 twin turbolaser batteries and a single dual medium turbolaser cannon for point defense. The point defense turret was located just aft of the communications array, while 4 of the 5 twin turbolasers were mounted in turrets along the sides of the midsection, 2 dorsal and 2 ventral. The last dual turbolaser was fixed and mounted on top of the cockpit. These weapons were fairly light, but they allowed the Consular-Class to be effective as a close-range skirmisher and picket ship. In the battles of the Clone Wars, these corvettes were also used as blockade runners, armed transports, evacuation ships, support vessels, and minor escorts for larger Republic fleets. With that said, the Consular-Class was not intended to be a warship, and its use by the Republic Navy was mostly out of desperation. After the first half of the war, combat use of these corvettes declined, and by the end of the war, most ships of the class had been destroyed or decommissioned. The surviving vessels were overhauled again. The point defense turret was removed, the forward turbolaser was replaced with a dual mount ion cannon, and a pair of concussion missile launchers were added. These ships, too, were phased out of Imperial service, but many were picked up by the Rebel Alliance. Consequently, the Consular-Class saw a resurgence in the early stages of the Galactic Civil War, as the Alliance frequently used these ships as corvettes or smuggling ships. So that's our look at the Consular-Class cruiser, a highly underrated prequel-era ship. But what do you think? Are there other ships from the Phantom Menace that you'd like us to take a look at? Let us know your thoughts in the comment section below, and as always guys, thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you in the next video.